Well, my mother won a trip to Europe in a church raffle, and the coach stopped on the way to Paris to go look at an old church, the last thing I wanted to do. And nothing, Justin, prepared me for the glory of God made manifest there, and all of my shallow teenage objections to God completely dissolved.
This all comes down effectively to this disenchantment that we sort of have inherited.
The new atheism, it's dead, it's completely dead. Nobody is interested in atheism, but people are desperate for re-enchantment. The church simply wants to stay relevant to this generation. It needs to stop being woke and reach these young people where they're searching, which is for enchantment, which is for an experience of the supernatural.
And I hear that there's something of a boom in Orthodox circles.
I do believe that there's something that the Western Christianity needs, that the Christian East has preserved, that numinous sense, that mystical sense. I went to the Holy Fire ceremony at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Fire comes down inside the Holy Sepulchre itself. People for like 8 minutes are putting their hands through these big flames, and it's not burning them. Justin, it happened.
I suppose my disenchanted mind wants to say, oh, there must be some trick.
Well, something happened recently since the book was published. Do you mind if I share it with you?
Please do.
No, part of me said, I don't want to tell people this because it sounds extremely weird, but you know what? If God did something so powerful in my life and so lasting, I can't keep it hidden.
Hi there, welcome along to today's conversation with Rod Dreher, a hugely interesting dive into the surprising rebirth of belief in the supernatural and how miracles, angels and the demonic are now being talked about openly in many quarters. Do like this video and subscribe to the channel to get more Thinking Faith conversations here on YouTube. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to my newsletter and I'll send you a free chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. The link is below. Enjoy the show. Welcome along to the show. Delighted to be talking today to Rod Dreher, who's a journalist and cultural critic. He's a New York Times best-selling author of books such as The Benedict Option and Live Not by Lies. But his latest book is Living in Wonder, Finding Meaning and Mystery in a Secular Age. And I'll be talking to Rod today about his own conversion via beauty and the miraculous to some extent, and whether our present disenchanted world is ready to hear and see the beauty and enchantment of the Christian story once again. So welcome along, Rod. Great to talk to you.
Justin, it's great to be back with you.
So I really enjoyed reading this book, partly because there were so many areas of overlap with my own book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. A lot of what you've put your finger on, I feel like, I've been noticing similar trends. This kind of bubbling up, if you like, of an interest in spirituality and Christianity, both in intellectual circles, but also just, among people generally. But going off in different directions, to put it mildly, in some cases. So I'm just looking forward to exploring all of that with you today. Tell me, though, how this all started for you, because you reference a couple of times in the book this moment in Chartres Cathedral in France where something took hold of you and it was really the start of your Christian conversion. Would you mind telling us about that?
Sure. I was raised in a small town on the Mississippi River in South Louisiana. And by the time I got to be a teenager in the early 1980s, I had put faith aside. My family weren't big churchgoers. We were Methodists, but Easter and Christmas Methodist. By the time I got to be around 15, I decided that Christianity was bunk, that it was really just the white middle class at prayer, and that it had nothing for me. Well, my mother won a trip to Europe in a church raffle and didn't want to go. She knew her son was entirely caught up in Ernest Hemingway and wanted to go to Paris, so she sent me. I was the only young person on a coach full of elderly American tourists, but I didn't care. I was going to Paris. Well, the coach stopped on the way to Paris about an hour outside the city to go look at an old church, the last thing I wanted to do. But I got off the bus anyway, followed the old people in to what was the Chartres Cathedral. I didn't know anything about it, and nothing, Justin, growing up in late 20th century small-town America, prepared me for the glory of God made manifest there in the stones and the stained glass of Chartres. I remember standing there in the labyrinth, the famous labyrinth, looking around in the nave, and suddenly All of my shallow teenage objections to God completely dissolved. I somehow knew that God existed, and not only that he existed, but that he wanted me. I didn't convert right there on the spot, but I did leave the church on a search. And it was a search that took a number of twists and turns through university, through reading Kierkegaard and this and that, and wrestling with God. And it came to a culmination about 2 years after my graduation. It was in the early 1990s. I was working as a journalist there in Baton Rouge, the capital of Louisiana. My editor sent me to interview this elderly Catholic priest, Monsignor Carlos Sanchez. Now, Sanchez was so old, he had been born in the 1890s, but he was still with us. And he had been, before going to the priesthood in his 50s, he had been a well-known art professor and indeed an artist himself. And that was what my editor was interested in. But I went and knocked on the old man's door. He opens it, and it was like Yoda, right? He was a short little man with this, his face was just peeling light, and he was so tender and invited me in. We sat down to talk. And of course, I asked him his life story. And he told me that he had been sent by his parents, who his father was a coffee planter in Guatemala, been sent to the U.S. for his Ivy League education, lost his faith there, but didn't dare tell his parents. He didn't want to hurt their feelings. He was called back in his 30s to Guatemala City. His father was dying and wanted to have a public mass of reconciliation in the cathedral. So Sanchez went to receive the communion, not believing any of it, but didn't want to upset his parents. When the priest held the host out, a dazzling light came out of the wafer, and he audibly heard a voice say, "I have always loved you." He went back to America, to his job, and repented very severely. I mean, he said he would get up in New Hampshire at 4 in the morning on a winter's morning and take a cold shower. And then he began to feel a call to the priesthood, but it didn't make sense back then. Must have been the 1940s. They didn't need priests as they do now. And so he resisted it. He went back to the cathedral in Guatemala City for another family event. Same thing happened. But this time the voice said, "Why don't you do as I ask?" And so he entered seminary and was ordained. Now, this was all fascinating to me as a journalist, but what really made a difference to me was this old man, as he was talking about these events that happened 50, 60 years ago, he was weeping. And there was something about the tears on his cheeks that just dissolved the last bit of resistance to Christ that I had. I knew that I was in the presence of a witness. And this old man, his goodness, his holiness were so palpable that I left there and thought, I can't resist Jesus anymore. And so I went and signed up for RCIA, which is what they call the catechism classes in the Catholic Church, and became formally a Christian in 1993. Years later, thinking back on it, it was the bookend experiences of beauty, great beauty in Chartres, and then the experience of holiness, of goodness, of radical goodness in this old priest in Baton Rouge. And those two events opened the door, to my mind, to the truth of the gospel.
It's such an interesting story, both his and your own journey to Christian faith. And as I say, the book's quite autobiographical in parts, and you open up about, fairly contemporary struggles you've been on, and perhaps we'll come to that towards the end of today's conversation. But just sticking with Chartres Cathedral for a moment, I find it fascinating that we do have these monuments, these extraordinary works of art that people living in technologically, far inferior kind of times, if you like, were still able to create these majestic sort of pieces that were simply for the glory of God, and which the people working on them would not ever see the completion of. They were for future generations that they were really being created for. We seem to be able to put up buildings and tear them down again within 10 or 15 years today. And a lot of people have been pointing out in recent times, we just don't produce anything as beautiful as the medievals produced. What's going on there? Why is it only those ancient buildings that seem to, I don't know, that the presence of God seems to inhabit in ways that are today's brutalist architecture just doesn't seem to be able to?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that they had faith, and not only that they had faith, but the quality of their faith. We seem now in the modern times to think of faith as something that is disembodied or mostly disembodied, that we see a church as just a place, a meeting room for the body of Christ to gather. But that's not how they saw it in the Middle Ages. They believed that, well, as we Eastern Orthodox Christians say, that God was everywhere present and filled all things, and that it was our task as Christians to recreate the world to his glory and ordered according to his purposes. And I think that, your question or your comment brings to mind something that an architect back home in America, a guy who went to my church, told me. He said, he's a commercial architect. He said, I would really like to build something beautiful, but they won't let me. He said that the only market there is for things that are flimsy, that don't cost much to put up, that can be torn down easily, that is purely functional. And I think that there's probably something there for the church to learn too, that we have lost a sense that beauty is and permanence are things that can call us outside of ourselves and call us ultimately to God. One of my favorite films, you may have seen this one, is To the Wonder, a Terrence Malick film from about a decade ago. And in that film, the monastery at Mont Saint-Michel in France is the controlling symbol for the presence of God throughout history. And in the film, it works as this sort of symbol that tells us God is always there. And we can always turn back to him as long as there are things present among us like Mont Saint-Michel, these beautiful monuments built to the glory of God. It is a reminder that this is always a choice for us, that we can always turn back. And living as I do now on continental Europe, I mean, it is really sort of a tragedy to me, I guess, that there's so much beauty, so much church beauty everywhere, and yet the churches are mostly empty.
It's interesting. Just shortly before we're recording this, I was interviewing N.T. Wright, and he was telling me a story of his daughter when she was younger, having some friends over. And she'd asked him, look, don't talk about God or Christianity, Dad. They're not into that sort of thing.
That's Tom Wright. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. So he was having to restrain himself. But they ended up, because it was a rainy day, they ended up all going over to Durham Cathedral, where they'd lived at the time. And one of these friends of hers just broke down in tears when the choir was singing, and in obviously this extraordinary, building. And they ended up having a very long conversation about God and spirituality in the end. But it's interesting to me that it is those kinds of buildings that evoke even very often secular people to kind of consider things differently. When I speak to people like Tom Holland or Nick Cave, it's in ancient churches that suddenly have the capacity to suddenly think, well, maybe this is true. There's something about this. What is it about being in an ancient space, not just a beautiful space, I suppose, that brings that sort of nearness, that thinness, I suppose, between heaven and earth?
Yeah, well, what is that famous Philip Larkin poem, Church Going, in which the speaker in the poem is an atheist who's out cycling along in the English countryside. And it ends with something along the lines of people will always be gravitating to places like this, looking to become more serious. And they're consecrated places, if only because so many of the dead lie around. I think that is something, and one of the great things I enjoy about coming to your country is to go to old churches and think about the men and women of ages long past who worshiped there, who came there to baptize their children, to marry, and to bury their dead. There's something so deep there, the resonance with human community. Of course, I believe we meet God there, but there's an embodiment of the faith that gets soaked into the stones, and into the stained glass. And I think in some sense, that's what I was responding to in Chartres. And even though I didn't have the words or the concept for it, but it called me, it's interesting. And people have this experience when they go to the great cathedrals. They feel both very, very small, but also very large in the sense that the immensity of the cathedral evokes the idea of God, and I'm very small in the face of God, but also it's ennobling. It calls us out of ourselves into something higher and to someone higher, ultimately, if you're seeing it with the right eyes.
Yeah, I was just looking up that that Larkin quote. The way he puts it is, "A serious house on serious earth it is," which I think is, yeah, perfect encapsulation of what those places built, you know, to reflect the majesty of God, do to people even today in our very post-Christian West. I mean, the book itself that you've written is just a kind of an exploration of the way in which we do see a turn, I think, away from a kind of very materialist kind of view of life to people sort of opening up again to the idea of the spiritual and the ways in which we can embrace that in our own lives if we call ourselves Christian. But also I see it as a kind of a call to those who are perhaps on the edge of faith and wondering whether to sort of jump in as well. I suppose this all comes down effectively to something you set out and have talked about briefly already, this disenchantment that we sort of have inherited in the modern world. Where's, just talk about those two phrases. I co-host another podcast called Re-enchanting, so we talk about this quite frequently there. But for those who are perhaps not familiar with this idea of disenchantment and enchantment, how do you define those, and what would you say are the marks of a disenchanted culture versus a culture that is looking for re-enchantment?
Well, I'll tell you one thing they're not, and that's enchanted in the sense of being magical, or the Disneyland sense of the word. That's very trite, and we use it all the time. I'm using it more in the way that the sociologist Max Weber used it, to talk about a world in which the sense of the spirit has gone out of the material things and out of people's lives. So a disenchanted world is a world that's thoroughly secular, a world that, and also a world in which even Christians who do affirm God do not feel his nearness. God has become much more of a concept than what Marshall McLuhan called a percept. I love McLuhan's distinction there between percept and concept. He said that a percept is something that you experience directly through the senses. And said McLuhan, who was a faithful Catholic, true religion is percept. But of course, we have to be able to conceptualize things in order to be able to talk about them. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is when we lose the perceptive aspect of the encounter with God, and God becomes merely concept. I think perhaps the greatest example of that is what St. Thomas Aquinas experienced at the very end of his life. You know, perhaps the only rival to Augustine for the greatest intellect Christianity has ever produced is Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the Summa, you know, the probably the most complex conceptualization of the Christian faith that ever was. And yet, in the last year of his life, he was celebrating Mass on December 6th, I think it was 1273, and he had a vision, a mystical vision there. We don't know exactly what he saw, but he told his secretary that after what I have just seen, everything I've written seems to me as so much straw. And he never wrote another thing and died within the year. Well, there you have it, percept and concept. And in the modern age, you know, because of various historical and philosophical and even theological events, we have allowed our Christian faith to become almost entirely concept. What I'm hoping to do with this book is to draw believers more to the perceptive side of things, not entirely, because we need to be able to talk about these things intellectually. But I'm tracking in parallel, Justin, with Ian McGilchrist, whose life's work seems to be to help people understand the brain hemispheres and how they affected culture. And as you know, I know you've talked to him before, Ian says that we have gotten stuck in our left brain, in the analytical side of the mind, and lost touch with the right brain, which is the perceptive faculty. And Ian doesn't believe that we should exchange one for the other, but he said we need to have more balance. Therefore, says Ian, we need to lean more heavily into music, into poetry, into the ways that allow us to perceive truth in other ways, in non-propositional ways, and not only perceive it, but participate in it. My Eastern Orthodox Christianity, I'm a convert of 18 years to Orthodoxy, it really emphasizes this, and it has helped me to grow greatly in the service of Christ.
Hi there, I hope you're enjoying the show. If you'd like a free chapter from my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and also from my latest book, Why I'm Still a Christian, then subscribe to my newsletter and I'll send you those chapters along with updates on my work. I won't spam you, just encourage you with Thinking Faith articles, events, videos and resources. The newsletter link is with the info. Enjoy the rest of the show. I was just reaching for my bookshelf for my copy of the Master and His Emissary, which is probably the best known of McGilchrist's books, in which he lays out this very profound thesis on the left and right hemispheres of the brain and the way in which, as the title suggests, the left was supposed to be the servant, the emissary of the master, the right hemisphere, which does the sort of the big picture thinking, the more intuitional and imaginative and holistic side, if you like, but that their roles have sort of been inverted in Western culture, and now we live in a very left hemispheric world where everything is seen in terms of purely its data points and, you know, pulling everything apart and thinking that you've seen the whole picture.
Right, and how instrumentalized everything becomes, you know. There's a book that came out a few years ago by Yuval Noah Harari. He's Silicon Valley's favorite pop intellectual, and it's called Homo Deus. And he's celebrating the fact, he believes, that we have now progressed to a point technologically and morally where man is his own God. He thinks this is a great thing. But the thing that really stayed with me about that book is something he said about the early modern period. He said that we in the West exchanged meaning for power. What he meant by that was when we evacuated the material world of meaning, of intrinsic meaning, of the logos, it became stuff, mere stuff that we could use to fashion however we like to impose our will on the world. And this brought us many great things, many great inventions. You can't gainsay, anesthetic dentistry, that sort of thing. However, there's been a tremendous cost. And Ian McGilchrist writes beautifully about that. We're lost in the cosmos now. We feel that there is no meaning to be had outside of our heads. And now with the advent of the internet, this is making us even more Gnostic, even more separated from our bodies and from the material world. And I think that it is not a coincidence, Justin, that the generation that has been raised entirely on the internet with smartphones is also the one that is by far the most mentally troubled, with emotional and mental problems, as well as the loneliest. I mean, think about it. This is the most socially networked generation that ever lived, and yet they report the highest levels of loneliness. It's because they've become disembodied, I believe.
Yeah, I can never work out with Yuval Noah Harari whether he embraces this or is worried about it. I mean, sometimes I read him and he seems to be sort of welcoming our transhumanist future in which we've completely severed, our bodies and brains and from the soul, or our imagination of the soul, I suppose, in his view, or whether he's somewhat worried about this exchange of meaning for power. I don't know how you read him, Rod.
Yeah, I read him as thinking this is a good thing, but I hope I'm misreading him because it's an incredibly bleak future. But this is what the transhumanists want. They want to be able to have total control. And as I write in the book, there's a German sociologist, Hartmut Rosa, who has a really interesting idea that he calls resonance. He said, a healthy person feels a sense of resonance with the world beyond his head. And I think that's a pretty good approximation of what I mean by enchantment. We feel like there is meaning, ultimate meaning beyond us. Rosa says that in order to experience this resonance, or I would say enchantment, you have to establish some sort of relationship with the person, place, or thing beyond yourself. And the resonance will emerge in that middle ground. But when we move to try to manage the thing and to control it, that's when the resonance, the enchantment flees. The more you try to control, the less you believe that there is something meaningful there. And with the case of transhumanism, this ultimately is what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it's interesting because what I do appreciate about Yuval Noah Harari is he sort of grasps the nettle. He's very clear as an atheist materialist that he does not believe such a thing as human rights exists. There's this famous clip that circulated last year where he said from a TED talk, cut open a human being. Tell me where you find these human rights. All you find are organs and liver and DNA. And he said these idea of human rights are theological inventions. They are things we have invented as a story about humans, but they don't exist. Of course they don't exist. And this was seized upon, interestingly, by a number of his fellow secular peers who were a little bit worried about this sort of idea that, oh, of course, human rights don't really exist. We've just invented them theologically. But people like Tom Holland, the historian, were happy to point out to Yuval Noah Harari, well, of course, yes, these are theological inventions. That's what we've been saying all along. The difference is that I think Tom Holland wants to steer people back towards the idea of God, because what do we become if we kind of cast aside this idea that there's more to human beings than, matter and, organs? Whereas Harari seems to want us to just accept that as a sort of brutal reality, and we need to do away with these fairy tales and so on. So I feel like there's people who recognize this. They're just perhaps pointing us in different directions. Tom Holland wants to say, well, let's look again at this Christian story if we've essentially still believe this mythology about what humans are.
Yeah, I think that Harari may be the sort of person, or at least would appeal to the sort of person who would say, because there is no ultimate meaning, then we can do what we like. We can improve, quote unquote, improve the world as we like, including improving the species by genetic engineering, transhuman, that sort of thing. Someone like Tom Holland would say this is horrific, and so would I. But I think that we in the West for so long have been coasting on the fumes of Christianity that we just assumed that things, that categories, that substantive moral teachings that come out of the Christian faith, we've just assumed that these were obviously true. And, the Enlightenment tried to secularize Christianity and proclaim human rights as being self-evident. But they're really not. Yuval Noah Harari gets that. Tom Holland gets that. But I'm afraid that we in the West are going down a very dark path. You and I are talking today on the election day in the United States. Some people are saying democracy is on the ballot. Democracy is going to die. In fact, I think what we're seeing in America, whoever wins the election, we're seeing a clash of post-liberalisms. And I think we can't keep liberalism as we've come to understand it in the West without having a shared conception of the good. And that was provided for us by Christianity. Now that Christianity has declined into almost irrelevance, it's very hard for people in any Western society to agree on what is good. Even as late as the 1960s in my country, Martin Luther King and the civil rights leaders, it's significant that they were pastors. They spoke the language of Christianity, literally the language of the King James Bible, but also the moral language of Christianity. And they led a revolution, a moral revolution in the United States. It's impossible to imagine something like that today simply because the people, the American people, don't have the kind of knowledge and shared commitment to Christianity, however weak it might have been, that made that possible. And I think we're in for some really dark times ahead.
There are some sort of prophets out there, though, speaking about what we lose when we lose the Christian story. And person we've already mentioned, Tom Holland, I almost see as one of those in an interesting way. You kindly shared a little clip a few weeks ago that I shared on my social media of Tom Holland talking about the idea that we need to keep Christianity weird if we want it to be sort of interesting and accessible and engaging for people who are looking for meaning in our culture today. In fact, why don't we just watch or listen to that clip just now?
Churches have to major on what they have to offer that everyone else doesn't. I think the problem for Christianity is that it's been too successful. Basically, everyone has accepted its essential principles. You get them all. Everyone should be, kind to the poor and all this kind of thing. Everyone buys into that. The things that the church traditionally did, education, hospital, poor relief, this has all been nationalized. So what is there left for the churches to do? What there is left for the churches to do is to talk about the stuff that no one else is talking, which is all the supernatural stuff.
You wanted to retweet this clip Rod, of Tom talking about the need to engage the supernatural weirdness, actually, of Christianity. He says, the kind of moral assumptions are kind of a given in many parts of Western culture, though even those are perhaps slipping away in various ways. That was what marked Christianity as weird ethically in the first century, no longer seen as weird to believe in human rights, equality, dignity, and so on. So maybe we need to major on the weirdness of the supernatural, speaking in tongues, angelic visitations, miracles. He even shared in this conversation his own experience, actually, of what seemed to him a miracle that he had regarding a sort of a bowel cancer diagnosis. But you wanted to share that. What is it about that keeping Christianity weird that speaks to you and is obviously important to this new book you've written?
Right. Well, I agree with the point Tom was making there, that the world, the secular world, gives humanity so many of the things that the church used to give. Charity, charitable services, for example. But the one thing that the secular world cannot give the world is, that secularism can't give the world, is the supernatural. And it's true. That's the thing. If it were just a lie, a nice myth to keep people in line, that would be one thing. But these stories happen constantly. There's a great book that came out late last year called They Flew, F-L-E-W, They Flew, by Carlos Ayer, a professor at Yale. And in it, he goes back and looks at the archives in the early modern period in Spain, and they had so many attestations. People signed their names, hundreds of them, saying they had seen monks, priests, nuns levitating. Now, it sounds crazy to us today, but this was widely attested to for whatever reason in that period. And Carlos Ayer, who is a National Book Award-winning historian at one of the top universities in America, also a Catholic, and he's a man of such reputation that he doesn't care what people think of him. He said that as a historian, there is no other area of historical inquiry in which we would simply dismiss hundreds and hundreds of testimonies to an event except religion. Well, these things also happen today, too. I don't know of anybody that's been seen to levitate, but we do have miraculous things that occur. And I talk about many of them in the book because I want people to understand, the reader to understand these things happen. In fact, the time I met Tom Holland, I met him once. We had drinks in London one night in the company of Martin Shaw, the great mythologist. And Martin told Tom, and I knew the story from Martin, but Martin told Tom about how he himself, 3 years ago, had experienced a dramatic miracle out in the woods in Dartmoor. A light appeared in the sky above him on the 100th night of his meditations. A colorful arrow came and hit the ground, and he began to have a series of dramatic symbolic dreams. And Martin had been raised a Christian, but he had left the faith behind long ago. He was so disturbed by these dreams, he contacted Malcolm Guite and said, "This is what's happening. I think I'm being pursued by Christ. What should I do?" And Malcolm told him, "You'd better get to a monastery and get ashes." It was Ash Wednesday. And anyway, Martin converted, became an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And there we were, sitting in Soho in London with Martin giving this extraordinary testimony to Tom Holland, with Tom nodding along, saying, "Of course." And it changed Martin's life. He ended up losing a number of readers, I understand, from his pagan readers who were deeply distressed that he had become a Christian. But it didn't matter because Martin was a mystic and is a mystic defined by Karl Rahner as, quote, someone to whom something has happened. It happened to him. I've had things like that happen to me, nothing quite so dramatic. And I've met so many people to whom these things have happened. And I should say, too, Justin, that one of the most startling moments in researching this book came to me in Oxford. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference with Ian McGilchrist, as a matter of fact. A young man, 27 years old, an Anglican ordinand, approached me in a break and said, "Listen, I feel like I need to tell you something since you're writing about enchantment. Your generation," he said to me, I'm in my mid-50s, "your generation thinks that the great challenge today to my generation is a new atheism. It's not. It's dead. It's completely dead." I said, "Oh, well, what's the challenge?" He said, "The occult." He told me that in his generation, nobody is interested in atheism, but people are desperate for re-enchantment. And they don't go to the church for it because either they think they can't get it there, or they don't want the morality that inevitably comes with and has to come with being a Christian. So they turn to psychedelic drugs and to worship of the occult. And he said that before he went to seminary, he worked in London, and he was the only Christian in his office. Well, that's no surprise. It's London. But he said there were no atheists either. Well, what were they? I said. He said everyone was involved to some degree or the other with the occult. And there were even two open Satanists who defined Satanism as learning how to be the most fully human being you could be. And he went on to end by saying, Rod, this is going to be what I'm going to face the rest of my life as a pastor, this occult. And your generation in the church doesn't understand it, but you had better wake up because re-enchantment is coming, and it's coming hard whether we want it or not. So I would say, Justin, from that, there are lots of conclusions to be drawn from that, but one of them certainly is if the church simply wants to stay relevant to this generation, it needs to stop being woke and trying to, be the Labor Party at prayer, and instead should reach these young people where they're searching, which is for enchantment, which is for an experience of the supernatural.
Yes, and I've seen the same thing as you, Rod. I think it's one of the reasons why horror films continue to be very popular in our culture, because they speak to a kind of a huge interest actually in the supernatural, in the dark side, if you like, of enchantment. But they're also filmed I sort of appreciate. I can never actually watch them because my stomach churns a lot of the stuff. But nonetheless, they take the supernatural seriously, and I think that they've got at least that going for them in those kind of horror films. Likewise, people are still playing Ouija boards. They're still dabbling in stuff. There's on TikTok, there's this phenomenon called witch talk, which is young women, sort of learning how to cast hexes and charms and all that kind of thing. So as you say, it hasn't gone away. It's just sort of coming back, manifesting in new forms very often. And there's some tremendous stories in your book of people who've been through that, particularly the story of one young ordinand who was himself a Satanist and went through all of that stuff until he kind of came out the other side. But I suppose, how do we, because this is my thesis as well, Rod, that we're not any less religious than we used to be. We're just sort of religious about different things. So it's either some kind of political ideology or sacred cause in terms of sexuality and gender that becomes someone's sacred thing, their sacred story, or it's these pagan forms of spirituality that are returning. And G.K. Chesterton famously said, when people stop believing in God, they don't thereafter believe in nothing. They have the capacity to believe in anything. But if there is this kind of, if you like, spirituality and an openness to enchantment is coming back in, how do we ensure it's the true version, the Christian story, that people are clinging on to, rather than all these other directions that people can potentially go in?
And that's a very important question. And that's why I emphasize in this book that the book is about Christian re-enchantment, not re-enchantment in general, because there are these false forms, the occult, psychedelic drugs, and even technology, all make a claim on us, claim to enchant our experiences. But these are all dark pathways. I think that, I'm part of an authoritative tradition, Eastern Orthodoxy, but there are others in Christianity. And we have to test the spirits, so to speak, to see if they line up with what we know from Scripture to be true and from our authoritative traditions. I used to know, when I lived in New York many years ago, I knew an evangelical Christian, and good man. We would walk around Manhattan talking about the faith all the time. And he was forever saying, God told me to do this. God told me to do that. And I would say, well, what do you mean God told you? And he couldn't understand my question. And my question was simply, I believe God speaks to us too, but we have to be able to discern what is simply something that comes out of our head or something we've imagined, and what is really coming from God. He didn't understand what I was saying. He thought I was a man of weak faith. But I've noticed over the years, I've lost touch with him now, but I would notice from our circles, keeping in touch with him, he kept making bad decisions because he would have a thought that he said, well, this comes from God, and then act on it, and it often didn't work out. So there is that problem too, and I would hate people to read my book and think that they need to throw themselves utterly into an irrational, emotional form of Christianity. We have to have balance.
Indeed, and that's in a sense what the institution of the church, of kind of good doctrine and everyththing else kind of gives you. It gives you, if you like, a container, but hopefully the freedom within that to see that God still moves in surprising ways. I have sort of, it's interesting that your own journey in a way does at various points reflect that kind of that openness to needing, as you say, to experience God, not just to know about God in a sort of just in a purely theological or intellectual way. You write very candidly about sort of personal crisis you were going through, and very specifically you say it was a prayer, the Jesus prayer, that sort of, and repeating this almost as a mantra for hours on end, that sort of brought you through that. And I'd just be interested in you sharing that story, what first of all the Jesus prayer is, and how saying that particular prayer brought you through this moment.
Right. Well, the Jesus prayer is fundamental to Orthodox Christian spirituality. It comes from the Desert Fathers. It's very simple. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Or even shorter, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. The way Orthodox Christians pray it is, ideally you're supposed to make yourself very still and quiet. You force all of extraneous thoughts out of your mind, which is very difficult, but you have to try. And you place yourself in the presence of God, and you breathe in with your silent prayer. You breathe in, Lord Jesus Christ, exhale, Son of the living God, inhale, have mercy on me, exhale, a sinner. Simple thing to do. The difficult thing, Justin, is to quiet your mind. Now, the crisis you're talking about came about in 2012. I was living in Louisiana. I'd moved back down there to be around my family after my sister died, but found out all kinds of family secrets that indicated that we would never be able to settle down there. I fell into a deep crisis of anxiety, of rejection, and it manifested as chronic mononucleosis in my body. The rheumatologist said, this is coming for your anxiety. You're never going to recover unless you leave here. I said, well, I can't do that. My parents are old and they're difficult, but I'm the only child they have left. He said, you better find inner peace some way. One of the things that happened then was my Orthodox priest assigned me to pray the Jesus prayer for an hour a day. I thought, you can't be serious. That's, to sit there quietly for an hour a day and do that. It would have been, even as weak as I was, it would have been easier to walk 6 miles into town. But I did it out of obedience. And Justin, it was one of the most difficult things I've done, because I'm someone who lives online. I work online. I'm a writer. I'm constantly being stimulated by online media. And to sit there and try to push this stuff out of my head was immensely difficult. But I persisted in it. After a month or two, it began to get easier. And finally, it was quite easy to do. And I noticed that I became much more calm in my interior. And I think it gave the Holy Spirit a beachhead from which to fight this illness and anxiety in me. When I was fully recovered, both emotionally, spiritually, and physically, I asked my priest, how did you know that's what I needed? He said, oh, it was simple. I had to get you out of your head. And that was it. And it's not like the Jesus prayer is magic, but it was the way that you brought up the name of Christ, but you placed yourself silently in the presence of God and allowed the Holy Spirit to work within you. That was so key to me. And, I thought about this, and I bring it up in the book because I found out in researching this that attention, the capacity to pay attention, sustained attention, is key to enchantment.
Again, something Ian McGilchrist points out in his own work.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, McGilchrist is great on this. And also Matthew Crawford, the American philosopher who recently converted to Christianity. But he talks about this in his earlier books, about this is the thing that we are lacking in the world today. Certainly, the advent of the internet has sent this on a rocket ship. We've all lived through it. We all have the experience. You and I are old enough to remember 20, 30 years ago, we could sit there for an evening in an armchair and read a novel without getting up. Now, I can't go 20 minutes without having to check my Twitter and all that. And I'm someone who knows how crazy this is, but this is how it is. Well, there are neuroscientific reasons for this. And we are, by immersing ourselves in digital culture, we are fragmenting our attention and making it much harder to perceive God around us.
Hi there, it's Justin again. I love bringing you these conversations, but I can't do it without your help. please do consider becoming a monthly supporter of my work. And as a thank you, you'll get early access episodes and bonus content, and Gold supporters even get free signed copies of my books and the chance for a monthly catch-up too. The link to support is with the show info. I was just looking up a quote that you reminded me of by Blaise Pascal. And now this was 400 years ago. He wrote this. He said, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." And I mean, goodness me, that was written in an age before the internet, obviously, but before many of the things we have today. And yet even then he could not diagnose that the problem is our mind, and it just being absolutely distracted constantly, and that is just on overdrive in obviously in today's culture. So it's so interesting to hear though that the Jesus prayer sort of helped to kind of calm your mind in that way. Now obviously there arguably is just a material explanation for that. You know, you were effectively engaging in a form of meditation, and that's very common today as well. Lots of people turning to, you know, Buddhist forms of meditation or you know, what's the modern word for it?
Mindfulness.
Mindfulness, yes, that's it. And I think, you know, a lot of people, even the Sam Harrises of this world, will say, well, there's no need to invoke any deity or supernatural aspect. This is just a good way of training your brain. And that's what you were doing probably, I imagine Harris saying to you with your Jesus prayer. What's your response to that? Is it ultimately just a sort of neurophysical, you know, effect of kind of going into a meditative state?
Yeah, I think it could be that. I didn't choose to dissect my experience. I just gave God thanks for it. I think it certainly could be that. But I would also say that when one becomes quiet like that and open like that, you make yourself more porous. You know, we often use thoughts, even frenzied thoughts, to buffer ourselves from the outside experience. And to become meditative is to become much more aware of the world outside of ourselves, in good ways and in bad. I mean, in the book, I talk about warnings that exorcists and others give about taking psychedelic drugs, for example, to make yourself, to open yourself up to the numinous. They do work, but you're opening doors that shouldn't be open. Now, I'm not saying that a Buddhist who meditates is opening themselves up to an evil spirit. Don't understand me saying that at all. But for me, I look back, and I still practice the Jesus prayer, but I look back on that as making myself open to the numinous in a way that was guarded, in a sense, by the holy name of Christ. And I felt guarded and protected and within his protective hand when I was doing that deep mental work.
Yeah, it's been interesting because we did a whole show on psychedelics, and particularly the story of Ashley Landy, who's got an extraordinary story of having gone from atheism to this kind of deep dive into psychedelics.
Oh, I read that. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a great story, isn't it, that she has. And my eventual takeaway with this was that certainly there's obviously for some people, psychedelics have opened the possibility of God, you know, that it suddenly something flips in their brain and suddenly they see the world a different way. But there's also, I think, this great danger of essentially it's kind of like a fast food version of transcendence. It's kind of, you're getting something, but not in the way you're supposed to get it, not through that kind of long-term attention. It's a kind of fast food sort of magic diet pill almost, you know, that makes you lose weight, but you still continue eating junk food. So for me, it's again, it's one of these enchantments that seem to offer something, but and show that people are kind of looking in the right direction, but they're often kind of ending up with something that's not the real thing in that way. And I suppose again, it's that question of how, if we are a Christian and we want to point people looking for God, how do we point them to the real thing? I suppose that perhaps that might just be a taste of, but not the real thing.
Justin, this is why I was honest in the book about my own experimentation as an undergraduate in the 1980s with LSD, and it was a way station on the way to God, and I've kept it quiet. I've not talked about it over the years because I'm embarrassed by it, but now with psychedelics having an immense moment, I felt that it was necessary. If I'm going to write a book about the dangers of psychedelics, I need to own up to my own past and the fact that taking LSD recreationally as a freshman in college The guy I took it with, my roommate, he just had fun. But for me, it turned me inside out, took me out of my narcissistic depression, and made me alive to the presence of God. I felt that the veil really had been lifted. Rupert Sheldrake says that everyone who goes through these, who tries psychedelics, they don't feel that they've hallucinated. They feel that they have been able to see through the veil into a deeper reality. And that's certainly how I felt. But what I did on Monday morning after doing the drug, I went to the college bookstore and started looking for books about Christianity, because I somehow knew in my heart of hearts that the drug, I'd had a good experience on it, but this was a cheat. But it did give me a push out of myself and towards the world outside, beyond my head, the world where God is everywhere present and fills all things. But to go back to what you were saying a second ago about this is like fast food, I compare the psychedelic experience, comparing it to the mystical experience of those who've had this transcendent through long prayer, fasting, meditation, and so forth. It's like someone who wins the lottery. You know, a man who becomes a multimillionaire because he has worked hard and saved and invested and been careful over the course of a lifetime has a very different relationship to money than someone who's just won the lottery. And we often read in the newspapers about people who won the lottery and it destroyed their lives because they didn't know what to do with the experience of money. Well, I think psychedelics can be that way in terms of spiritual experience. But even if you're lucky and have a good experience, which is not guaranteed at all, it could ruin you spiritually in the same way because you have all this unearned experience.
Yeah, yeah. And this was interesting to hear Ashley Landy, you know, as you'll know from having read that book, you know, almost perfectly describes her own experience of chasing after something, but ultimately opening the door to things she didn't really understand. And it's a murky world that you're kind of opening the door to when you dabble in that, or in indeed any kind of occult activity as well. Just as we begin to land this, and thanks so much for kind of sharing so candidly of your own experience. You do that a lot in the book, and that's something I really appreciated in it, Rod, because you're quite open as well about some more recent issues, personal circumstances in your life. You were divorced a couple of years ago, and that was not something you had wanted or expected in your life. And it kind of precipitated, a sort of personal crisis again. But you do end the book by talking about a quite extraordinary week, the worst and the best week of your life that was actually a Holy Week a couple of years ago. So do you want to just tell us about that, if you can share some of the details of what led to that moment and some of the things that happened as you spent a week in Jerusalem shortly after?
Yeah. Well, my marriage collapsed in 2012 because of all the things we ran into down in Louisiana. But my wife and I, now ex-wife, we kept it together for the sake of the kids. And I figured that we would be together until our youngest went off to university. That would have been the fall of 2024, but it wasn't to be. In 2022, I was here in Budapest on a fellowship. Woke up the morning before Palm Sunday that year to an email from my wife saying she had filed for divorce the day before. Now, it was a shock to me because we had never once talked about divorce, but it wasn't a surprise because of how bad things had been. Well, I got on a plane the next day for Jerusalem. I had planned to spend Orthodox Holy Week in the Holy City, not only as a worshiper, but also for the sake of my book, to see how the numinous and the transcendent manifested in the rites of Holy Week. But Justin, I got there to my hotel in the Old City, dropped my bags, and went straight to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which, you know, was built over both Golgotha and the tomb from which Christ was raised from the dead. I went straight up to the chapel over Golgotha, fell flat on my face, and just said, "Lord, have mercy," and prayed the Jesus prayer for I don't know how long, because I was shattered. But the Lord put me back together that week, over that course of the week in Jerusalem. One thing that happened that I think is just so marvelous, it was Good Friday. I came out of my hotel to go out and go to services, and there was a Palestinian chambermaid in the hallway vacuuming the floor. And I said good morning, smiled to her, and I noticed she had a little cross around her neck, a little woolen cross. And I said, "Oh, I love your cross." She looked at me and said, "It's yours." She put it around my neck. I burst into tears, and she got a little scared. I said, "I'm so sorry. I've just had the worst week of my life. My wife is divorcing me, and here we are on Good Friday, and you showed me mercy. I want to thank you for that." And she said, "My name is Angela. People tell me I'm their angel. They tell me their stories, and I keep them in my heart." I said, "Well, you were an angel to me." So later that day, I went to the Holy Fire ceremony at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, this is an ancient ceremony where the Orthodox believe that the fire comes down inside the Holy Sepulchre itself, lights candles that the Greek Orthodox patriarch has. He brings it out and passes it around the church. Now, you can go on YouTube and see videos of this where people for like 8 minutes are putting their hands through these big flames and it's not burning them. They're putting it to the flames to their face. It's not burning them. I thought, well, okay, I can believe that this could happen, but I have to see it myself. Justin, it happened. The holy fire came to me. I had my sheaf of 33 candles. I moved my hands slowly through it. Nothing. And they had told me after about 8 minutes, we don't know why, it becomes normal flame. And that happened too. They even took some of these candles I had bought in Jerusalem back to America to light them to see if they might have been treated. No, you couldn't touch it from the beginning. That very night, I'll end on this. I know we're running out of time, but that very night, I went back to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for Easter liturgy. I got lost. You know, the old city of Jerusalem is rabbit warrens. And I got lost and found myself down a dark street. And I said, I've got to backtrack. I said, "Lord, please send me an angel to help me find the church." And I laughed at myself for making that prayer. Don't you know, when I got back out to the well-lit street, there was Angela, the chambermaid. She rounded the corner with another man. I said, "Angela." She said, "Rod, how are you?" I said, "I'm great, thanks to you." No, thanks God, thanks God. She introduced me to her brother, and then I asked her, "How can I find the church?" She gave me directions, and there I found it. So the Lord did speak to me. He did send me an angel in the form of a Palestinian chambermaid who just happened to be at the right place at the right time. So these sort of events, they didn't take the pain away from my heart of divorce, but they did show me that God is there. He's vibrantly there. He's accompanying me, and that all my suffering, as long as I united to him, it does have ultimate meaning, and that he'll bring me through it. And he certainly has.
Yeah, it is an extraordinary story. I've seen videos of this holy fire ceremony, and I suppose my disenchanted mind wants to say, "Oh, there must be some trick, must be some tourist thing." But from reading your account of it, I was okay. Something's happening, and I'm glad that it had a kind of a sense, yes, of it was part of obviously a healing process that's, I'm sure, ongoing in your own life, Rod. But I love
something happened recently since the book was published. Do you mind if I share it with you?
Please do.
Well, this is very recently. In a lot of my work, I've talked about the anxiety and the brokenness I've had because of my relationship with my late father. My father was a very good man and a loving father, but he was also a man of the countryside in Louisiana. He wanted his only son and namesake, me, to be a hunter, an athlete as he was. And I was a bookworm, and I had a tender heart for animals and was terrible at sports. So I knew that he loved me, but he was deeply disappointed in me, that I hadn't been the boy he wanted. And this affected my relationship with God the Father for most of my life. And I've been repairing that for a long time. And yet, my dad died in 2015, and yet I have not been able to shake this deep sense of shame, a sense of unworthiness. I can't think my way out of it. I know this is a lie, but there it was. Well, because of the work I had done in this book, Living in Wonder, with exorcists to talk about the way the demonic works, I had this strange intuition about 2 months ago in prayer. Maybe there is a dark spirit of shame, of unworthiness that's hovering around me and keeping me trapped in these suicidal thoughts. And I was never really a risk for suicide, but having these compulsive thoughts of killing myself because I'm not worthy of life. Really dark stuff. Well, I was heading to a conference in the U.S. in late September. My own spiritual father and confessor, Father Nectarios, he's a trained Orthodox exorcist. I met him in my hotel room and I said, "Listen, I have a question for you. You might think I'm weird, but would you mind saying some deliverance prayers over me? Because here's what I think might be going on." It's not weird to him. This is his world. He prayed over me for about 20 minutes. Nothing happened. But the next morning, Justin, I woke up in a new world. I kid you not. As soon as my eyes popped open, I knew something radical had changed. I felt like this dark cloud that had been over me for all of my life, so much that I thought this was normal, gone. I felt that it was like I had this heavy woolen blanket, wet blanket wrapped around me, weighing me down. I thought it was my skin, gone. I couldn't believe it. I thought this must be just some euphoria over the prayers last night. Here we are 5, 6 weeks later, Justin, and I'm a new man. I have not had a single compulsive thought of suicide or any bad thing. Suddenly the barrier between me and God seems so thin. I feel like God has given me my life back. Now, why did it take that? I've been praying against this sort of thing for many years and to no real effect. Yet it took an exorcist saying ordinary deliverance prayers, casting these spirits out, if any spirits were around me, for this to happen. Now, part of me said, I don't want to tell people this because it sounds extremely weird, but you know what? If God did something so powerful in my life and so lasting, that I can't keep it hidden.
Wow. Wow. What a way to end our conversation. Praise God for that. I'm just delighted to hear that has happened. I can highly recommend this book. I was glued to it, Rod, but also the challenge it gives to sort of, because often we end up listening to a lot of podcasts, watching a lot of videos, reading a lot of books, but we don't necessarily do the stuff that actually brings God into the present. And that was the challenge for me, to live a life with more expectation and more kind of, anticipation that God is doing things, and that we can actually orientate ourselves towards that. My great hope is, and part of the reason why I'm featuring you on the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God as well, is that more and more people are waking up to that. So just as we finish, you have, you entered the Orthodox Church. You tell the stories of a few people, our mutual friend Martin Shaw, Paul Kingsnorth, and so on, who have done the same as adult converts. And I hear that there's something of a boom in Orthodox circles, especially young men, interestingly. Do you feel like something's happening at the moment? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, we are having an Orthodox moment, it seems like. And I'm very upfront in the book about my Orthodox faith. I do center the experiences of Orthodox converts I know, not because I'm trying to convert people in the book. I wrote this book for all Christians and even for non-believers. But I do believe that there's something that the West, Western Christianity, needs that the Christian East has preserved, that numinous sense, that mystical sense, and that this is a gift that the churches of the East can offer to the churches of the West in this time of their crisis. And I'm seeing it happen too, with many people turning to Orthodoxy now, desperate for that sense of enchantment that is so palpable within Orthodox services. And young men as well, especially after COVID, we've seen this happen. And I think the answer to that is because there's something about Orthodoxy that's deeply serious and involves the body. Orthodoxy, as opposed to so many Western forms of Christianity, is not therapeutic. I mean, it is therapeutic in that it wants you to be well, spiritually healed, but it's not about thinking better thoughts. My Orthodox priest in Louisiana once told me, he said, people come to the church seeking relief from pain. And I tell them, you can find relief, but you're going to have to go through surgery, and it's going to hurt more in the short term for you to be healed. But they don't want that. They want the pill, the spiritual pill that's going to mask the pain. Well, Orthodoxy appeals to young men, I think, because it gives them a challenge. It gives them the challenge of fasting, of overcoming self, and becoming a holier and better man, not just feeling better about yourself, but by doing things, and doing things with your body. That is so crucial. I learned a few years ago from reading Paul Connerton, the late Cambridge anthropologist, that all of the communities that have kept their traditions against the flood of liquid modernity did so because they had a few things in common. They held a sacred story in common. They celebrated the sacred story in an unvarying ritual. The ritual took them outside of time, they felt, and most crucially, they involved their body in celebrating the sacred story. And in that sense, the sacred story and its tenets got sedimented into their bones. This is orthodoxy to a T. And I think that's what young men are responding to.
It's been so fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much, Rod. And as I say, the book is available now, Living in Wonder, Finding Mystery and Meaning in a Secular Age. I'll make sure there's a link from today's show. Thank you so much for talking to me today, and God bless you as you continue your own journey and help hopefully to illuminate the path for many other seekers besides.
It was a great pleasure, and glory to God.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Rod Dreher. If you want to watch the conversation I mentioned to him, the historian Tom Holland telling me about his answer to prayer, then check out this video of our conversation live in London last year next. And you can visit the link below for signed copies of my books, a free chapter with my newsletter, and to support my work. Supporters get free signed copies, early access, bonus content, and monthly catch-up calls with me. Again, the link is below. Thanks for watching.